Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I'm going to return to a book that I've looked at many times, History of Political Philosophy, edited by Leo Strauss and Joseph Cropsey. Today I want to look at Cicero. The last few episodes I looked at Stoicism and Epicureanism. Once those are out of the way, we've basically covered the major points of ancient Greek philosophy. Not to say we won't come back to it, but we've kind of worked our way from start to finish through the basics of Greek philosophy. And the Epicureans and the Stoics are the two major Hellenistic philosophies, the two major philosophies after Aristotle. I'm not going to talk about Neoplatonism, I don't believe. So we're going to jump to Rome here, ancient Rome, and Cicero. We'll talk a little bit about Cicero. I really like Cicero. Kind of like the Epicureans, I don't think he gets his due as a thinker. He is known as a bit of a eclectic fellow who took bits and pieces of different Greek philosophies and tried to combine them in certain ways or compare and contrast them. I really appreciate that. I think that's great and necessary. But it's not always really appreciated in the modern world for whatever reason. The eclectic temperament. But I like Cicero. It's the eclecticism is a mark, I think, of his desire to balance different competing ideas. And this also comes through with his political ideas about the mixed regime. Take a little bit of monarchy, a little bit of aristocracy, a little bit of democracy, the best parts of each, combine them into the mixed regime, and that's the best, most realistic way forward. So I really appreciate that mentality. It's kind of pragmatist. It's kind of expedient. It's kind of practical. It's concerned with what is going to work and not what is ideal. Although he talks about what is ideal, he's very concerned about what works, and we should be too concerned about what works. So I like Cicero. This particular essay is written by James E. Holton, and I think it's pretty good. Like all my episodes, I've got some sections to read. This one, not a tremendous amount of analysis on my part. I just want to read the important parts here and let you get a grasp for what Cicero is all about. He's kind of conservative, which is nice. You can get a bit of an idea about ancient conservatism. And he starts off, so Cicero identifies as a member of the academic skeptic school. But he does, like I said, adopt little bits and pieces of Stoicism. I think Stoicism probably more than the others. So I'll talk a little bit about what skepticism means to Cicero a little bit here. He says, quote, "A statesman and a serious student of philosophy, Cicero sought in his writings to place his considerable talent and experience as a rhetorician in the service of philosophy, in the service of what he suggested was the richest, most bounteous, and most exalted gift of the immortal gods to humanity. His task, as he conceived it, was to introduce philosophy into Rome. By philosophy, he meant not the dogmatic teachings of this or that particular school, but a way of life. The task was not simple. Philosophy is always regarded with suspicion and dislike by the majority of men, and particularly by those whose taste runs to the practical rather than the speculative. It is particularly suspect if its origins are thought to be foreign. The normal difficulty of introducing that which at all times runs counter to popular taste and thought was thus compounded for Cicero by the fact that the teaching was of Greek origin. The necessity for Cicero to tread lightly on Roman sensibilities and to supply a convincing justification for the existence of philosophy in Rome cannot be ignored if one hopes to appreciate the degree of circumspection with which he felt compelled to approach this task. Throughout his works, Cicero professes to be an academic skeptic, a member of that philosophic school whose origins lay in the Platonic Academy, but which in his own time stressed as its fundamental thesis the impossibility of absolute knowledge. Man, as man, the skeptics asserted, is limited to opinions of that which is more or less probable. Although man may seek to attain a higher degree of probability by examining, as Socrates did, the relative merits of all opinions, he will never at any point in his inquiry be assured of absolute certainty. He must act, if he chooses to act, with the understanding that the principles which guide his action remain problematic. While skepticism and the suspension of final judgment which it entails may be philosophically tenable, if such views are taken seriously and developed to their logical extreme by the mass of men, the outcome may well be politically disastrous. The thought, for example, that the commonly accepted standard of what is just and unjust lacks and must always lack a fully rational or defensible basis may not unduly disturb the theoretician. It may, however, if clearly impressed upon the mind of the populace, so shake popular confidence in the validity of such a standard that faithful adherence to it, or to any standard resting on such a tenuous and fundamentally arbitrary base, appears foolish. Such an understanding may lead to a widespread questioning of the truth, even of those principles which are perhaps essential to the existence of the political order. For example, that the common good should be preferred by the citizen to the private good. Cicero was well aware of the potentially unsettling effect skepticism, and perhaps philosophy as such, must have on the city, i.e., the political community. The stark and undiluted truth, the philosophic truth, may shake the very foundations of a given political order. Unlike some of the less perceptive members of his school, Cicero could not view this possibility with equanimity. He was aware of the ultimate dependence of philosophy on the city, and thus of the necessity for philosophy, if it was to survive, to concern itself with the development of a healthy political order. Only within such an order could philosophy exist. The philosopher, if this be true, must be guided by some understanding of the needs of the city and of the practical consequences of his teachings. He must not risk the chaos that might follow a systematic and ruthless public examination of the principles underlying and guiding a particular order, even an order which strikes him as radically defective, without having given some thought to the alternatives. A defective government, a government which falls far short of the best, may be better than no government at all. The philosopher must begin, then, with an understanding of what is possible, as well as what is desirable, and direct his efforts, in turn, to the improvement of the health of a given political order rather than to its destruction. End quote. Okay, so that's a great intro to Cicero and a great intro to the relationship between philosophy and politics. And he's basically saying that Cicero is a member of the academic skeptics school, but the academic skeptics insist on the lack of our ability to achieve absolute knowledge, which, as an aside, the academic skeptics are members of Plato's Academy. That's why they're called academics. And yet they seem to reinforce the Protagorean sophistic idea that man is the measure of all things. Because, for instance, he does say, man as man, the skeptics asserted, is limited to opinions of that which is more or less probable. We can't know for certain this, that, or the other. We're limited to our opinions of what we suspect to be the case. So it's our judgment that determines whether we say something is true or false. Do I think it's likely or unlikely? And our opinion factors into it. We can't say with certainty about a great many things. Nowadays, we tend to think that there's more that we actually can be certain of. But philosophically speaking, the question of how we actually can achieve 100% absolute certainty about anything remains an ongoing philosophical question. Right through Hume, and I think right through critical theory and postmodernism. And in some sense, we get this battle between the postmodernists and the first principle believing folks who, I don't know what the word is for this necessarily, but those who believe that we absolutely can and do know things to be true, that there are truths in the world and that we can know them. Foundationalism, I guess that would be, in opposition to relativism. And that's an ongoing debate today. Now, Cicero was sort of a conservative relativist, in a sense. I don't know if relativism really is the right word to apply back then, but he's a conservative skeptic. He says that we don't entirely know certain things, but we can't call everything into question because it could be damaging to society. And he says basically that if you spread the idea that we don't really know what justice is, the masses aren't going to take it as lightly as perhaps a philosopher will. And you run the risk of creating total chaos when you convince people that they don't really know anything, you don't know anything, nobody can know anything. Chaos could reign. The foundations of our city, what we as a city believe to be true. Are there any beliefs that we share with one another? And what are the consequences of kicking the legs out from under those beliefs? Are we willing to risk the crash of our society? Are we willing to risk total anarchy? Or what are we willing to risk here? He says that a flawed government might actually be better than no government at all, so one should approach philosophy carefully and delicately, and we don't want to upset the apple cart. We don't want to throw our societies into disarray. And he says that philosophers have to be concerned with politics because they have to have a society that allows them to engage in philosophy. This came up in the review of the Republic from a few episodes ago. The philosophers have a relationship with the powers that be, and they have to be concerned with that relationship, and they have to be concerned with the state of the city in order to engage in philosophy. And so that's important, and it's something that we ought to always keep in mind. Now, moving on from there, he begins to talk a little bit more about how Cicero views politics. So he says, quote, "The substance of Cicero's specifically political teaching is contained in two dialogues, the Republic and the Laws. Each dialogue purports to record an earlier conversation among Romans about political things. In the Republic, the conversation allegedly reported by Cicero took place during a Roman holiday in the year 129 BC, some 70 years prior to the writing of the dialogue. The conversation is one of 3 days' duration among men belonging to the Scipionic Circle, a group whose members combined achievements as Roman statesmen with an interest in philosophy. The Republic consists of 6 books, 2 devoted to each day's conversation. Cicero appears, and thus speaks in his own name, only as the writer of the preface, attached to the 1st, 3rd, and 5th books. The Laws serves to record a much more recent conversation, and one of a single day's duration, among Cicero, his brother Quintus, and Atticus, an Epicurean friend. It is generally thought that the Laws also contained, or was to contain, 6 books, but only the greater part of the first 3 books remains available to us. The rest of the manuscript has been lost. Time has been no kinder to the manuscript of the Republic, with the exception of the portion devoted to Scipio's dream and a number of quotations scattered throughout the works of writers familiar with the original, for example Augustine. The text of the Republic was lost for more than 7 centuries. Only fragments, perhaps 1/3 of the complete work, remained. When a copy of the manuscript was discovered in the Vatican Library in 1820. In view of the fragmentary character of the texts, of both the Republic and the Laws, and particularly of the former, any account of Cicero's political thought must remain provisional in important respects. The fundamental question to which Cicero addresses himself in these 2 works is that which guided classical political philosophy as a whole. What is the best political order? The Republic, the more philosophic of the 2 dialogues, is directed to answering this question. The Laws, to sketching the legal and institutional framework of such a regime. The answer to the central question, of course, presupposes some reflection on a number of related questions. although the reflections themselves may not be included in the more popular and consequently less exhaustive works. One such related question, that of the right life for man, is taken up in the introduction to the first book of the Republic. The question is, which is superior, the active life, i.e. the practical or political life, the life of the statesman, or the contemplative life, i.e. the philosophic life? Cicero's interest in this issue is not simply theoretical, but is stimulated by the growing tendency, encouraged among the Romans by certain philosophers, especially the Epicureans, to denigrate the political sphere, and to withdraw from participation in political matters. "We must free ourselves," Epicurus had argued, "from the prison of affairs and politics." Cicero's concern for the fate of the Commonwealth dictated that his opening remarks in the Republic be directed to the practical end of defending the political life. To this end, he examines the common arguments in favor of withdrawal, and, while conceding to them a degree of truth, suggests that they can be assigned little weight when viewed in the light of the individual's responsibility, both to the city and to his own nature, and in the light of the glories to be won within the public sphere. Moreover, he argues, it is absurd to suppose that virtue can exist in a vacuum. "The existence of virtue depends entirely upon its use, and its noblest use is the government of the state, and the realization in fact, not in words, of those very things that the philosophers in their corners are continually dinning in our ears." The man who has discovered the principles of virtue and compelled others to live in accordance with them, i.e. the statesman, must be deemed far superior, even in wisdom, to those who perhaps speculate about such questions, but abstain from any direct participation in political affairs. Cicero's position at this point seems unambiguous. The practical life is to be preferred to the contemplative life. Despite the fervor with which Cicero advances this opinion, however, there are some indications that he does not regard the issue as settled. His praise in the prologue has not been unqualified. The life of the statesman, while deserving of praise and conducive to fame, is neither a completely happy one, nor one chosen simply for its own sake. It is soon made clear that necessity and a sense of duty underlie its selection. End quote. So here we have a question about whether it is better to participate in politics or just step back and out of politics and just engage in philosophy. And the Epicureans, to their detriment, argued that you should step away from politics, and just engage in philosophy, not participate in politics unless you feel such a deep compulsion to do so that you wouldn't be happy if you didn't. The other option that the Epicureans put forward, and I talked about this last episode a little bit, is that in some cases a man may be unable to achieve ataraxia. He may be unable to achieve happiness unless the conditions in the city change or facilitate it, and for that reason he has to participate in politics in order to be able to get to his happiness. I would argue that that's the condition for every person in the city. The condition of the city affects their life. It affects their happiness. Be it a philosopher or a shoemaker, everyone has a stake in the condition of the city, and the condition of the city will affect their lives and affect their happiness. So everyone, philosopher or otherwise, should at least be aware of what is going on in the city and, to the best of their ability, a participant. That's not to say that every person needs to devote themselves to politics. The shoemaker still has shoes to make. But nevertheless, to pretend that a person can sort of box themselves off and just engage in philosophy while they still live within the city and still benefit from the networks of supply of foodstuffs and shoes and everything else that the city provides while not engaging with the city, that seems delusional, and I think the Epicureans were just flat out wrong on that count, and Cicero is correct. It's also interesting, of course, that his two books are called The Republic and the Laws. Plato's two major political works are also called The Republic and the Laws, and like Plato's works, The Republic is a little more philosophical, and The Laws is a little more practical. So that's interesting. What's also interesting is that much of The Republic was lost until a copy of the manuscript was discovered at the Vatican in 1820. That's not even that long ago. And it was missing for 7 centuries. So does that mean that that book that they found in the Vatican was 700 years old or more before that, since that book had been added to the library? Phenomenal how long that book could have been in there when it was discovered. That's just so mind-blowing. This ancient work of Cicero, very well-known ancient philosopher and statesman, could have a major political work of his just discovered like that. I find that so fascinating. I wonder what else is buried in the Vatican that we don't know about, that we haven't discovered yet. So moving on, he talks about, I had mentioned how he sort of combines things. He's an eclectic, so he combines a little bit of this and that. And one of the things he talks about here is combining old ideas about politics with new ideas about politics. And this is interesting, where he says, quote, "Those who charge Cicero with seeking only to restore the Republican Constitution of an earlier age also ignore the suggestion, implicit in both the Republic and the laws, that even when it was at its peak, the Roman Republic, the model, fell short of the ideal discovered in speech. The code of laws outlined by Cicero in the Laws, the code of that best state discovered in speech, is not identical with that of the Roman Republic at any time in its history. The participants in the laws, Quintus emphasizes, are not simply rehearsing the actual laws of Rome, but restoring old laws which have been lost, or else originating new ones. The specific deviations from what was historically the case are those dictated by reason, the ultimate standard of law and justice. The composite of old and new, which results, represents his attempt to bridge the gap between the popular or pre-philosophic tendency to identify the good with the old, i.e. the ancestral or traditional, and the philosophic identification of the good with the natural, i.e. that which is dictated by reason. By bringing reason to bear on the existing code rather than beginning afresh, Cicero speaks to preserve an essential sense of continuity with the past, and thus the sense of respect for the traditional, which normally exists in the political community. There are, of course, certain practical reasons for the use of an empirical model. Cicero's inquiry, which is Greek in both method and conclusions, must be given a Roman character if it is to prove congenial to the Roman palate. His task is thus rendered simpler, and his demonstration more convincing, if, instead of the shadowy commonwealth of the imagination, with which Plato is said to have dealt, he can illustrate his understanding of the nature of political things with a concrete example, and not simply any example, but the Roman example. The inquiry proper begins with Scipio's statement of the essential characteristics of a commonwealth. A commonwealth is the affair of a people, but a people is not any collection of human beings brought together in any sort of way, but an assemblage of people in large numbers associated in an agreement with respect to justice, and a partnership for the common good. This association ceases to be a commonwealth when it ceases to be guided by the ends, justice and common good, for which it exists. Scipio asserts that the commonwealth is natural, insofar as it is essential to the achievement of a happy and virtuous life. It comes into being not, as some philosophers have suggested, because of any weakness in human nature, but because of a certain social spirit which nature has implanted in man. Man is not a solitary or unsocial creature. He is driven by his very nature to seek the companionship of his fellows. The government of the Commonwealth is no less natural, for without some such arrangement, existence is impossible for a household, a city, a nation, the whole human race, nature, and the universe itself. When properly constituted, this government will reflect the hierarchical principle coextensive with the whole of nature, the lower being subordinate in each case to that which is higher." End quote. So he sort of calls out Plato here as crafting a shadowy commonwealth of the imagination, and that's really what the Republic, Plato's Republic, really is a hypothetical that doesn't bear any real resemblance or connection with any existing city. It's not like, let's take Athens as it is and tweak it a little bit. It's like, let's wipe the slate clean and craft a new city from the ground up and see what it looks like. And that's a fair exercise, but Cicero says essentially this has to be the sort of thing that is going to appeal to Romans, and Romans have a certain way about them. They're not going to want to see some made up commonwealth, some made up republic. They want to look at they want to start with Rome and just kind of make some adjustments and look to the past. There's a very deep respect for tradition and continuity and ancient things in the Roman psyche. And the fact that they can look back to the Rome of an earlier time as a model, they can restore some of the older laws that have been lost, is going to appeal to the Romans. And then they can also say, we're going to apply reason here, and we're going to evaluate it, and we're going to say some stuff doesn't work. We'll grant this, that some stuff doesn't work, but again, they can't they can't kick all four legs out from under the table and think that it's going to fly with the Roman people. So they have to just sort of gently analyze it and say, okay, well, we can make a few changes here, and we can make a few changes there, and this will improve what we've got. But we're starting with something concrete, and we're not just starting with thin air. And that's important, I think. I think that's a conservative approach. It's an approach grounded in reality, because we know that the existing system can exist. We know it's possible because it's real. Whereas the imaginary system, we have no verification that it can ever exist. And that's a problem, because you need to be working with the real. You need to be working with the possible, even more so. You need to be working within the realm of the possible, and you need to not spend too much time working in the realm of the impossible. And of course, it's important how he says that the Commonwealth is natural, because people are not solitary creatures. And so it's not some flaw in human nature that causes people to have societies, but it is human nature to have societies. What's also interesting is how Scipio describes the Commonwealth as an assemblage of people in large numbers associated in an agreement with respect to justice and a partnership for the common good. So there's a little bit of social contract theory way back in ancient times, which I always find interesting. And in a sense, Rome is large at this point in time. Rome is on the verge of empire. I don't think at this point that Cicero's writing it has really been declared an empire, but it's a large political unit, and it incorporates a lot of people from around the Mediterranean, and particularly in Italy and in France and in southern Europe. And I don't know the exact extent of the Roman Empire at the time of Cicero. Pardon me for my ignorance, but the point is, it's really not just a small group of kinsmen anymore. And so we go from saying that a city or a state is a group of kin to a commonwealth that's a group of people that are all participating in it in a sort of agreement to seek the common good together. So that's an interesting point right there. So now we finally get to the mixed regime, which is a core part, I think, of Cicero's ideas, and something that I just find myself very fond of, because I'm fond of the sort of expedient combination of various things in order to create the best system. That's important with combining the old and new, and it's important with the mixed regime. He says, quote, "The character of the Commonwealth is ultimately determined by the arrangements in regard to magistrates, i.e., by the form of government. The three simple forms are kingship, aristocracy, and democracy. The first of these, the rule of one, is characterized by affection. The name of king seems like that of father to us. The second, the rule of the best, by counsel or wisdom. The third, the rule of all, by liberty. Although kingship is judged the best, and democracy the worst of the simple forms, each of the three may offer a decent and even stable government, so long as injustice and greed do not destroy the original bond of the association. Unfortunately, each of the simple forms contains within itself not only certain defects, but even the seeds of its own destruction. In kingships, the subjects have too small a share in the administration of justice and in deliberation. And in aristocracies, the masses can hardly have their share of liberty, since they are entirely excluded from deliberation for the common weal and from power, and when all the power is in the people's hands, even though they exercise it with justice and moderation, yet the resulting equality itself is inequitable, since it allows no distinctions in rank. Before each lies its depraved counterpart, tyranny, oligarchy, mob rule, and history serves as a record of the inevitable tendency of each to degenerate into its opposite, and the latter, in turn, to be replaced at some future time by still another form. Thus, the ruling power of the state, like a ball, is snatched from kings by tyrants, from tyrants by aristocrats or the people, and from them again by an oligarchical faction or a tyrant, so that no single form of government ever maintains itself very long. While it is questionable whether even the enlightened statesman can interrupt this natural motion and circular course permanently, there is a way in which he can at least delay the movement. This lies in the creation of a moderate and balanced regime, a regime which incorporates a judicious mixture of the institutions and principles of each of the simple regimes, and exhibits in turn an even balance of rights, duties, and functions. Cicero's thought on this point has been anticipated by a number of earlier writers, including Plato and Aristotle, but his immediate guide in the matter of the mixed regime was the Greek historian Polybius. Polybius, seeking an explanation for the extremely rapid, almost unprecedented expansion of Roman power, suggested that the key lay in the mixed character of the Roman constitution, a mixture so successful that it was impossible even for a native to pronounce with certainty whether the whole system was aristocratic, democratic, or monarchical. For if one fixed one's eyes on the power of the consuls, the constitution seemed completely monarchical and royal, or if on that of the Senate it seemed again to be aristocratic, and when one looked at the power of the masses it seemed clearly to be a democracy. The mixed constitution made it possible to avoid the defects inherent in each of the simplest forms. It prevented an undue concentration of power and provided a system of checks and balances. Within such a framework, Cicero suggested, the magistrates have enough power, the councils of the eminent citizens enough influence, and the people enough liberty. If examined carefully, however, the mixed regime proves to be in the most important respects an aristocracy. The arrangements are designed to ensure that the aristocracy, and thus the element of wisdom or counsel, is assigned the decisive role. While a measure of power is to be vested in the people, it is expected that the actual authority will remain with the Senate, for liberty is to be granted in such a manner that the people are induced by many excellent provisions to yield to the authority of the nobles. The success of this balanced and harmonious constitution rests in large measure on the continued existence of an aristocracy, possessing the particular qualities described by Cicero in the Laws. The aristocracy, he suggests there, must be free from dishonor and a model for the rest of the citizens. The example presented by this order is decisive for the overall health of the Commonwealth. For it is not so mischievous that men of high position do evil, though that is bad enough in itself, as it is that these men have so many imitators. For if you will turn your thoughts back to our early history, you will see that the character of our most prominent men had been reproduced in the whole state. Whatever change took place in the lives of the prominent men has also taken place in the whole people. If the quality of the aristocracy is allowed to degenerate, it is extremely unlikely that the regime will manage to survive for any great length of time. It will certainly prove incapable, given such a deterioration, of achieving the ends for which it exists, the cultivation of virtue in the citizens. End quote. So here we see the introduction to the mixed regime. He says Plato and Aristotle both talked about this a little bit. Polybius talked about it. Cicero embraces it. So you've got kingship, aristocracy, and democracy. And again, we've seen this before. There's a sort of correct form of all three, the simple form, and then there's a degenerated form. Tyranny is the degenerated monarchy. Oligarchy is the degenerated aristocracy, and mob rule is the degenerated democracy. So there's a good version and a bad version of all three of these. And they cycle through because each one of them tends to degenerate into its worst version and then gets overthrown by someone else, which in turn degenerates. And there's this sort of endless cycle of different government systems as each one fails to perform its function of keeping the society virtuous and working for the benefit of the people and making sure that the nation is doing well, making sure that the Roman Republic is succeeding and doing well and prosperous. They just degenerate into some form of tyranny. The power corrupts the king, or power corrupts the aristocracy, or power corrupts the masses. Too much power accumulates in the hands of some faction, and there needs to be checks and balances to make sure that power remains dispersed among various factions in such a way that it can't ever be completely taken over, and you can't get tyranny if the king cannot take total power. If the other groups in society have power, if the people have power, if the aristocracy has power, the Senate has power, if the different factions in society all have a little bit of power, then the king can't just take over. That's sort of the premise here. And he says that what ultimately the mixed system looks most like in the laws is that it looks most like aristocracy. And I think there's something to be said for this a little bit because it's sort of the middle ground, right? It's not all power cultivated in one man's hands, and it's not all power completely dispersed amongst all the people, but in theory, it's power in the hands of the best. How one determines who is the best is, of course, a challenge on its own. And he talks about the Senate. In a sense, there may be people voting for the Senate. Again, I don't know the real ins and outs of Roman law, but it's intended to be this sort of middle ground here. And I would argue that even like the political power in the hands of like the middle class or even the upper middle class is, and I don't know how much of a middle class there was in Rome, but the middle class, having a robust, strong, powerful middle class is the best system as opposed to having a really powerful upper class or a really powerful lower class. A healthy middle class is very necessary for a healthy society. I think Aristotle sort of talked about this a little bit. But he does say that in order for aristocracy to work, the aristocrats have to be noble, good, honorable people. Which means that if someone in the aristocracy is not noble, honorable, and good, then there must be mechanisms, and the book doesn't talk about this. This is kind of my own insight here. There must be mechanisms to adjust who is and is not a member of the aristocracy. That if someone is dishonorable, they can be ejected from the aristocracy. And if people from among the common masses prove themselves worthy, they can enter the aristocracy. So there has to be some social mobility in order to prevent the oligarchy. There has to be a way of bringing in good actors and kicking out bad actors. People if it's the best, if it's truly the best, then you have to have mechanisms of finding the best that is more than just the children of last generation's best. Now, there may be part of that because children inherit the qualities of their parents and they grow up in an environment where they could be instilled with virtue. They've got good parents who teach them how to be good. But it can't calcify too much, or else the goodness of it is not really an important component. And it has to be. So that's interesting. Now, Cicero is sort of conservative. Some of the things that I've described so far in this episode that I've talked about sound a little on the conservative side here and there. I think the moderation is itself sort of conservative. So when he wants to moderate the excesses of any given political system, or he even wants to moderate the excesses of any given philosophical system. To me, moderation is a sort of conservative act, a conservative tendency. The tendency to be moderate is a conservative tendency. So Cicero, in that regard, has already demonstrated a bit of conservatism, but there's more. So here he says, quote, "The exposition of the theoretical principles underlying the mixed regime is followed by Scipio's account of the development and internal composition of the earlier Roman Republic, the practical illustration he promised earlier." The scene is set for such a historical treatment by Scipio's reference at the beginning of the discussion to a statement once made by Cato. The latter, a noted Roman statesman of an earlier age, had traced the superiority of the Republic to the fact that it was based upon the genius not of one man but of many, founded not in one generation, but in a long period of several centuries and many ages of men. It rested upon the collective wisdom and experience of many generations of men. Its institutions and practices had demonstrated their merit by passing the severest practical test, the test of time. Cato's thesis reminds one immediately of that advanced at a much later date by the English statesman Edmund Burke. The superiority of the British Constitution, Burke was to argue, lay in the fact that it was not the product of fabrication or conscious planning. It had not been formed upon a regular plan or with any unity of design, but had developed in a great length of time and by a great variety of accidents. The parts had gradually and almost insensibly accommodated themselves to each other. Its perfection represents the culmination of a natural process, of slow, continuous, and almost unconscious growth. Burke's understanding represents a radical departure from the position of the classical thinkers. The latter had taken it for granted that the best regime would be the product of reason and conscious planning. There is evidence that Cicero himself is closer to the classics than to Burke on this point. The basic difference between Cicero and the earlier Greek thinkers does not appear to spring from a disagreement in regard to the principle, the superiority of planning to accident, but from one in regard to the question whether the better plan is more likely to result from the efforts of a single wise man or those of a series of wise men. Cicero did not simply reject the possibility that the best state could be the product of the wisdom of a single founder. He agrees with Polybius as to the accomplishments of Lycurgus, the Spartan lawgiver. And he concludes his account of the contributions of Romulus to the development of the mature Roman order in the following vein. "Do you not perceive, then, that by the wisdom of a single man a new people was not simply brought into being and then left like an infant crying in its cradle, but was left already grown up and almost in the maturity of manhood?" But such preeminently wise men are rare. It is more sensible to plan on the basis of what is more likely to be the case. It is more likely that there will be a series of fairly able men, each of whom can be expected to apply some of the lessons of experience to the task of gradually improving the regime. End quote. So here we see the author compare Cicero to Edmund Burke. And he gets there by talking about Cato, an ancient Roman statesman, who himself spoke about how the superiority of Rome was because it was not just one person's idea who crafted it, but many people's idea, and it wasn't just crafted in a generation, but it was a long period of centuries and ages of men, and it's the collective wisdom and experience of many generations of men. And they've demonstrated their merit, the institutions and practices have demonstrated their merit by passing the test of time. And there's a lot of truth to this, and there's a lot of conservatism here. Well, Edmund Burke is considered one of the founders of modern conservatism, so if Cicero is speaking like Edmund Burke, we can say that Cicero is speaking in a sort of conservative manner, but that things that have lasted the test of time have proven themselves. So things that are old should be valued because they've withstood the test of time. There are other things that are old that are no longer around because they didn't work. So if it's old and yet it still exists, then it stood the test of time and should be respected on that fact alone. And also, what's important is that it's not based on just the wisdom of one man, because it's not likely to find someone of such great wisdom as, for example, Romulus. He talks about the great wisdom of Romulus, but it's unlikely that every generation is going to have a Romulus, or that there's going to be, always be a perfectly wise person or even a perfectly wise founder. The best approach is to recognize the reality that there are going to be a greater number of men who are mostly wise, who are generally wise, but aren't perfectly wise. And you find the wisest of the people that you have, and they're not perfect, but they're the best you've got. And you give them the ability to make adjustments, but not major adjustments. You give them the ability to do the best they can to use their wisdom to improve society, but you don't put the whole thing in one person's hands. You have to, just like you have to have checks and balances, you have to have power split between the monarchy and the aristocracy and the democracy and the mixed system. You're also combining the wisdom of multiple ages so that each age, each generation is a check against the other generations. Each generation has a bit of a say in how things go. And by that means you show humility and say, our generation doesn't know everything, but yesterday's generation also didn't know everything. So we can improve on what they've done, but we must not totally overthrow what they've done. This is humility, and this is a sort of slow, incremental growth of a system. Now, Burke talked more about it as an accident, as it's almost an unconscious growth, that things just sort of bump into one another and they find their common ground, or they find their correct position, just like water finds its correct position automatically. You don't have to guide water downhill. So too, like natural processes unfold where the system will correct itself through the subtle, gentle nudges of people colliding with reality. Bit by bit, problems come up and solutions get found, and they get added on to the system. It's not nearly as deliberate. Now, Cicero differs from Burke in that he talks more about it as if it is deliberate, but it's nevertheless dispersed across generations. That's fundamentally conservative, and it's true, and I think that like anyone who self-identifies as a conservative person should understand this principle, that we are sharing governance with the past and the future, because we don't have the confidence that our generation knows best. And we shouldn't, because that's hubris. Our generation is no smarter than the last generation and no smarter than the next generation. And so we'll contribute just as the past generations contributed and the future generations contributed, but no one gets to wipe the slate clean and start fresh. No one gets to make huge changes. We all get to make little changes. That's the best system. That's the most prudent system. That's the system that involves checks and balances, and that prevents chaos, and that ensures stability. That's the correct system. So now he talks a little bit about how difficult it is to get to the perfect system, and we sort of have to go with accept the best system that we can come up with. It's not going to be perfect, but we should accept that what we're really aiming for is, the best realistic system. He says, quote, Scipio's presentation is not meant to be simple history, but rather is designed to offer an idealized picture of the Roman past, a judicious mixture of fact and fancy. It is designed to demonstrate to the citizens the wisdom and justice of the Roman origins, to show them the firm foundations upon which this Roman example of the best regime rests. The presentation is, in its essence, a deliberate example of the Platonic noble lie. While it necessarily falls short of the philosophic truth, such a salutary account of the foundations of the Commonwealth may be essential to the cohesion and very existence of the political society. The statesman's task, Cicero would have us understand, rests not in the wholesale destruction of these traditional, if unphilosophic myths, but in placing the partial truth that they may contain at the service of those policies which reason informs him are conducive to the good of the Commonwealth. Scipio's historical presentation also serves to suggest the provisional sense in which the mixed regime is actually the best regime. His account indicates that the Roman decline began, in fact, with the transformation of kingship into tyranny. The mixed regime is not introduced until some time after this decline has begun. The unqualifiedly best regime for Cicero, as for classical thought generally, is that in which wisdom has an absolute right to rule, the absolute rule of the wise, the true aristocracy, and ultimately the absolute rule of the one man preeminent in wisdom and virtue, the true kingship, is the most desirable form of government. The rule of and by wisdom was possible under the early Roman kings, but this was to prove true only so long as the kingship retained its distinctive character. Its character, in turn, depended on the existence of a succession of good and wise kings, and thus on chance rather than planning. In view of this, kingship proves in practice to be the least stable of the simple regimes, the first and most certain to decay, and in fact it required, as Cicero emphasizes, only the excesses of a single king, Tarquinius, to render the very title of king obnoxious to the Roman people. Scipio's account indicates that the excellent constitution established by Romulus and maintained by the Romans for over 200 years began to wither with this transformation of kingship into tyranny. The subsequent history of Rome is written in terms of a series of more or less successful attempts to control the forces unleashed by this transformation. The mixed regime comes to sight as one such attempt to satisfy the popular thirst for liberty while recapturing at the same time a place for the wisdom and virtue characteristic of kingship. Cicero warns us in the Laws that the task of the statesman is to determine not merely what is best, but also what is necessary. One test of his political skill is the extent to which he understands the dictates of necessity, and succeeds in operating within the range of possibilities that necessity permits him. Where the absolute rule of the wise is impossible, the mixed regime allows statesmen to attempt to secure popular consent to the rule of wisdom, and thus to achieve that approximation of the best which is conceivable for most societies. The mixed regime incorporates the attributes of what we have come to call the rule of law. It seeks to embody the precepts of a wise founder in the fundamental laws of the state, and then to ensure that the subsequent administration or completion of these laws will be placed in the hands of those least likely to deviate from them and most likely to execute them in accord with the spirit permeating them. The essential elements of this basic code and the attributes of the governing class are sketched in some detail by Cicero in the Laws. The particular strength of such a regime lies in its relative stability, yet insofar as it seeks to bridge the chasm between wisdom and popular consent, it rests on a precarious foundation. Such a regime is not always easy to achieve, and once achieved, it is hard to maintain for any length of time. Even this second best, this approximation of the simply best, may not be possible for all peoples or at all times. End quote. So we have here some of the problems. He says really that the absolute best system ideally is true kingship, where the rule is in the hands of the most preeminent, wise, and virtuous man. The true aristocracy, the rule of the wisest men, is good. But if one man among those men is the most wise, why not just put it in his hands? But this seems like far-fetched a little bit, especially when you've got a monarchy that is hereditary. And so he says it's really up to chance whether or not the king is going to be wise at all. And that's precarious. It leaves so much in the hands of chance. So while it's, in the one hand, it's the best system to put all of governance in the hands of the single wisest man, in practice, it only takes one bad king to throw the whole thing out of kilter. One bad person can bring the whole thing down. And so it's susceptible to ruin, which makes it not really the best system in practice. And that's why the mixed regime is good, because it prevents that sort of collapse. And then he does talk a little bit at the end here about justice, which is interesting. It's actually very interesting, but I think I'm going to skip it. I've talked about justice a little bit a few episodes ago. I may have said this before. I'm not sure I said it with regards to this book, but if you're looking for a good book to get to like have a deep study of political philosophy, you can do a lot worse than this one. It's a thick book with a lot of essays about a lot of thinkers, but boy, it is full of insight. Every chapter talks about a different philosopher, and the insight you can gain into politics by reading through all these various people's ideas is tremendous. It's tremendous. So one last encouragement. Get this book and read it. And I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks for listening, and have a great day.